Chapter 3, we'll get started in verse 9. And as you recall, we're going through here. Ecclesiastes can be a dark book. And there's always some dark sections in just about every chapter, every lesson that we're running through. But it is the mirror image of the book of Proverbs. Proverbs, most likely written by Solomon, was a young man. And when you're a young fella, young person, you have a lot of oughtas. And what I mean by that is things just ought to be a certain way. You know, you get a job, you ought to be able to have that job until the point you retire. You do this, it ought to be that way. And so, remember Proverbs 22? Train up a child in the way he should go. When he is old, he will not depart from it. You know, as a kid, that makes perfect sense. You live for a while and you realize that's a proverb or a general truth. Some kids are raised right, and yet, because of free will, they go whichever direction they want to go. And so Proverbs is written in a very positive way. Ecclesiastes appears to be written by an older man who is jaded, who is tired, who is worn out, and looking back on life. And so there's a lot more darkness, negative stuff. You know, you get older and older. The example I use a lot of times, when I was young, anytime I saw a penny, I picked it up off the ground. You get your 30s, you only pick it up if it's heads, right? And then you get a little bit later, and you're like, I'm not getting that, I'm not getting down there. Because you don't get down unless you have a plan about getting back up, right? Some people reach that age where you have to just live that way and make those plans. Ecclesiastes is written kind of like that, where you got to have those plans which are there. So last week we talked about the bird song. There's a time for everything under heaven. Remember that song? Okay. And so today we're looking at verse 9 in which we go to. And so as we look at this class, as we look at this lesson, we're going to talk a lot about work. More so than just work. You know, the New Testament says if a man will not work, neither let him what? Eat. In other words, Christians should have a work ethic. You need to get a job. You need to find a way to add value to society. Paul wrote, let him who steals, steal no longer, but rather let him work with his hands that he may give to other people. As a Christian, as you mature as a Christian, you work so that you can give rather than living so that you can take from everybody else. And so that's one of those ideas which we're going to come across as we run through here. But here's the thing about jobs. They're usually not a lot of fun. And a lot of times, you know, we think, man, I'll get a job. This will be great. Get to do this, do that. And then after you've had that job for a few years, Monday rolls around and you're just like, oh man, here we go again, right? And you know, you go through and it's like, okay, I need a paycheck, so I got to go today. Now, see, this is the wrong class because all y'all are retired. And once you're retired, you don't do anything, right? Any of y'all busy? Are you busy? All right. But you remember back when you worked, back when you had those jobs and a lot of those things which are there. Okay, so that's a little bit of what's going on. And so let's go ahead and read verses 9 through 11. What profit has the worker from that in which he labors? I've seen a God-given task which the sons of men are to be occupied. He has made everything beautiful in his time. He's also put eternity in their hearts so that no one can find out the work that God does from the beginning to the end. Now, if you remember, the last chapter, Solomon brought up this idea of finding what makes you happy. And we went through the 4 things in chapter 3, if you recall that. And one of them was building great things. One of them was accumulating great wealth. Now, what happens, or what's the issue with accumulating great wealth? If you are 100 years old and you have $10 million in the bank, are you going to be able to take it with you to heaven? I used to always say that the hearse at a funeral home never had a trailer hitch. And then I saw a funeral home that they actually did have trailer hitches on the hearse. I'm not sure what they were doing, but they had the trailer hitch on there. The grave for a man who is a billionaire is the same size, I'm talking about the hole, same size as the grave of a man who's a pauper. We all end up at the same place. What you got, man?
I think it was Johnny Carson who said this.
Yeah.
He said that he spent the first half of his life trying to earn his
Okay, a man spends the first half of his life trying to earn money, second half of his life trying to figure out how to hang on to it. Yeah. And the way Solomon puts it in chapter 3, a man gains a lot of money, it could be a woman, a person gains a lot of money, and then he leaves it to people who waste it, don't care about it, it doesn't matter all that much anymore. You know, things which matter to us don't matter so much. We got a wedding shower table. I bet they didn't ask for china, right? Remember when china was such a big thing and everybody had to have those special plates and such? Younger folks today, they don't want to inherit your dishes, okay? Unless it's a Yeti cup. That's worth something right there. But, you know, they don't want to inherit your dishes so much. And so what Solomon says in chapter 3 is you accumulate all this money and then you end up leaving it with somebody who doesn't care for it well, doesn't care about it, it doesn't really matter, and all this stuff you built up in your heart for a legacy, you're forgotten. It goes on. And so he's finishing that thought a little bit here in chapter 4. And so what profit? What good does it do you to work at the factory for 38 years? What good does it do for you to be a school teacher for a long time? Yes, you have an imprint on other people, but what good does it do for you to last at a certain place, to live for a certain place, to do a certain thing? Those things seem to be so small. But verse 11 is one of the key verses in the book. It's a beautiful, beautiful verse. But sometimes we pass over it because you have to think about it. He has put eternity in your heart. Think about that. He has put eternity into your heart. Now, you can read the notes if you want to, but what does that mean? He's put eternity into your heart. Will this world ever satisfy? No. Solomon had all the money in the world. He had all the building projects of the world. He built a huge temple, then built an even larger palace. He was able to work with this book, showing his wisdom. He has references in the book of Ecclesiastes all the way down to Cush, which would be Ethiopia, all the way down to Samaria, which would be Babylon, all the way up to Jordan. In the days before Encyclopedia Britannica, before the internet, he is able to source his book from places all over the world. He has done great things, and yet he keeps using that word, vanity. You know, I've done all these things. It didn't do me a bit of good. And so he puts it this way, God's put eternity in our heart. There is only one thing that can satisfy, and that thing is God. Now, in youth group stuff, the way that you illustrate this is you write on the board or you have some object, and it's got a hollow part in it that's the shape of a cross. And we talk about how your heart is empty unless it's filled. And you know, youth ministry, you have to use a lot of object lessons and such. Basketball, does it fill that? No. How about a $1 bill? No. How about a $10 bill? No. It's the highest I ever went because I was always poor as a youth minister. Food? No, food won't fit in there. The only thing that fills the heart is the cross. God has placed eternity in your heart. And one of the reasons why there's so much anxiety and so much war in this world, one of the reasons why people are so angry all the time is because everything they search after doesn't fill you up. Everything you look for just doesn't do it. There's a shortage because God has placed eternity in your heart. If you go back to Genesis 1, 2, and 3, and you don't have to turn there because we're just going to talk about the general aspect. God makes Adam and Eve. They're in paradise, the Garden of Eden. Everything's perfect. They're happy. They have everything they could ever need. Everything is perfect. That was God's design for each and every one of us. Adam walked with God in the cool of the day every single day. That'd be so fascinating to see what that would look like, what that would feel like. Everything was perfect until Adam and Eve sinned, were thrown out of the presence of God. And ever since that happened in Genesis 3, there has been a shortage in the heart because eternity's not there, because God is not there. And so God's placed eternity in our heart. So it's such a fascinating thing. And so It's spiritual thirst, looking at the notes, eternal value that nothing in this world can fill us with. We get a glimpse of God in this world, but we don't really see the fullness of what will be there. We don't see him face to face as we go through. Now look at verse 12. I know that nothing is better for them than to rejoice and to do good in their lives. All right. Now we're going to talk about why there's evil in the world, and we're going to touch on that for just a few minutes here in a little bit. But notice verse 12. Nothing is better than to rejoice and do good in your life. We can't control circumstances. I cannot determine when my body is going to weaken, when I'm going to pass away necessarily. I cannot determine when a job comes, when a job goes. I cannot determine how other people think about me, how other people treat me. But I can say, whatever circumstance I have found myself to be in, I have learned to be satisfied. Remember Paul saying that in the book of Philippians? I'm content in every circumstance which I face. Life, enjoyment of life goes so much back to attitude. You have one person who gets a job, okay? And they're working in that job and it is drudgery. They don't want that job. They don't like that job. Every day they're there and they're just going through the motions enough to where they don't get fired. And they're just going, they're upset at the manager all the time. They're upset at everything else in the world. They hate it. You have a person right next to him, and this person, for whatever reason, maybe he was homeless and now finally has a job. He is excited by the opportunity to have this job. And because of his excitement, he enjoys seeing people. He enjoys whatever the manager says to him. He enjoys being there at every moment of the day because this is great. I have got a job. The requirements of this man at work are the exact same as the requirements of this person at work. But this person, even though he's making the same amount of money, is absolutely miserable. And this person is having a time of his life. What's the difference? It's outlook. What's the difference? It's the way in which you view the world. And what Solomon is going to be telling us here is the secret, one of the main secrets of the happiness in your life, one of the big keys of how to be satisfied is attitude. Attitude. You see people who expect the world to serve them, and when they don't, they're miserable. You see people who you just see everything as drudgery, see everybody as trying to attack them, and they spend their life miserable. And then on the other hand, you see people, same job, same circumstances, but they're loving every moment because they see that it's a gift from God. They're loving every moment because of the opportunity that is there. All right, talking about that, where's our attitude? Oh yeah, Jerry, I'm so glad you're back.
Ziegler, one of the famous sayings.
Yes.
Ziegler was, your attitude determines your altitude.
Attitude determines altitude, Zig Ziglar would say. Absolutely, that's a good way to put it, very succinct. Yep, attitude determines altitude. All right. And so, in your life, this last week, where has been that attitude? What has been your outlook on life? And if you're miserable, I hope you're not miserable. If you are stressed, if you're angry, is it really because of the circumstances? Or is it because of the way that you look at those circumstances and the way that you view those circumstances? Yeah, it's our choice of how we're going to handle it. Okay? Back in counseling circles, one of the things that counselors will always say, and it is aggravating as all get out because I want to control people, but you cannot control another person. You cannot determine whether that person likes you or dislikes you. You cannot determine what the attitude of it. The only thing that truly in counseling circles that you control is yourself. Now, you can control yourself to the point to where maybe you are more popular. Maybe if you treat somebody, they will treat you better back. But really, the only thing that I can control is my attitude and my actions. And so that's what we're seeing here as we look through. Now, 12 and 13, We looked at 12, but let's read 12 and 13 again together. And this is a glimpse of what we're going to see in chapter 12. Remember the whole conclusion of the matter, fear God and keep his commandments. We're starting to hint there. We're going to hit it here. We're going to hit it chapter 7. We're going to hit it chapter 9. Solomon goes up, almost opens the door to let us see in. And he's like, oh, wait, let's talk some more. And he's going to come back a little bit later. This is the first time he opens the door. I know nothing is better for them than to rejoice and do good in their lives. Also that every man should eat and drink, enjoy the good of all of his labor. It is the gift of God. The job you have right now is a blessing from God. The spouse, the parents, the children you have right now, blessing from God. The circumstances you're going through, even if you're not healthy, this day is a blessing from God. And that's why we call it the present, because it's a gift that comes from God. And so whatever you do, take it as a gift. Realize it's a reminder, especially those bad days, is a reminder of what it could have been before even. Enjoy the life that you live. Now, sometimes as Christians, we're talking so much about the difference between the spiritual and the physical that some preachers, get that little finger and point, and they act like you shouldn't enjoy anything on this world. But God made this world for us to enjoy. He made the seasons for us to enjoy. He made day and night for us to enjoy. He made the beauty of creation. We're already getting some things to bloom, right? It's an opportunity for us to enjoy things. I have joked with my kids over the past 3 weeks, 4 weeks, how long ago I was always excited. The trees are blooming, the grass is coming back, flowers, it's going to be wonderful. I've reached that age where I look out there and I think, I'm going to have to mow in about a week. And it's all attitude, right? But I've reached that attitude of going, oh, time to mow, time to get this going again. That's an example of that attitude that works there and how all these things have. Okay? Whatever God does, notice there in verse 14, it shall be forever. Nothing's added, nothing's taken away from it. God does it that men should fear before him. That which has already been and that which already has been, God requires it as an account. God is in charge. Whatever's happening, God put it that way. Now, that's usually not how we view things. We're such strong believers in free will, and I agree with free will, we forget the sovereignty of God. In Acts 17, Paul tells us that the nations, their boundaries move back and forth because God decides where they go. That people live their lives the length because God decides where they live, what they do. God is in charge. And so when that happens, it allows us to think about God's in charge. We'll get to this at the very end of the chapter, and I may be talking so long. Yeah, we still got time. God has made it to where no matter what, he is in charge. So what's our attitude at that point? Huh? It's hard to hand it over. It's hard to let somebody else be in charge.
The first part of this is so wonderful in the way, because if we can step back and let him take that, we get what we need. It's not maybe what we expect or what we want, but eventually we do end up getting the things we do need when he wants us.
Yeah.
And that's very hard to do. Very hard to let go of that.
We want to be in the driver's seat.
Yeah.
And when we look back at our life and realize we weren't in the driver's seat, what we usually see is that God has directed things the way they need to go.
And he gave us what we needed.
And he gave us exactly what we needed. Yeah. All of us have had things in our life we didn't really want to experience, perhaps. And once it's passed, we look back and, God has seen us through it. It isn't always great, but God has seen us through it, and his grace is sufficient to see us through. Yeah, we have to grow in faith. Yeah, our faith has to be strong in him. And that's just such a powerful thing that we see there. You're not going to add to God. You're not going to remove from God. God is the answer. And so you move with God. Now, does that mean that you don't need to work? Does that mean that Paul did not need to go on those missionary trips? Well, he needed to go. But God was in charge. God was blessing him and helping him as he was working and as he was doing those things. That's true in our life as well. All right, look at verse 16. Moreover, I saw under the sun in the place of judgment. Oh boy, here we go. Wickedness was there in the place of righteousness. Iniquity was there. All right, look there in verse 16. At this point, the chapter changes and it gets dark again. God is in charge. We just talked about how refreshing it is that God's in charge. He makes all things work for good, that we get to see him, that things work well. But even though he's in charge, this world is still a bad place. Places where righteousness should be, iniquity is there instead. Too often. And it's in the legal system. There's wickedness and oppression. That's looking ahead, chapter 4. God does not ignore injustice, but he'll bring it to light at the appointed time. And so that's the hard part there, because I expect God to have a perfect world because I grew up with the oughtness there. There are levels of apologetics where you prove that God exists. Ontological, well, one of the ways in which we prove it, we always use these Latin words, I'm not sure why, but one of the ways that you know God exists is within us, every one of us, there's a sense of justice. One of the first phrases these kids learn and teenagers say all the time is, "That's not fair." Did you ever hear that from your kids? Not, well, maybe I've heard it a few times. That's just not fair, okay? Now, how do kids naturally get to where they can say that all the time? It's because within each one of us, we see a way that the world should work. And the world does not work the way we think it should, especially when we're teenagers. But that's not fair. We look at the world, and I tell people this every once in a while, and it's probably bad taste. The wrong people get sick. The wrong people die. There's a lot of times, I don't like doing funerals, but I really don't like doing funerals for certain people, the ones who I treasure and the ones who I love. And I think to myself, why would that person be sick? And God, what about all these other people? Why do you let the evil live so long and make the righteous leave too quickly? I look around at the world and I see wars which are going on in all these nations. God, why are you allowing these innocent people who are not involved in the war, but they're just civilians? Why do you allow that to happen? And I look at the world so much and say, that's not fair. God, that's not the way it should be. What's interesting about the Bible is the Bible, you can tell it's written from God because it doesn't contain all the answers. I mean, in a sense it does. It gives us all we need that pertains to life and godliness. But there's a lot of times where we find out the unrighteous are going to do well. The book of Habakkuk. Habakkuk's arguing with God. He never preaches to anybody. The whole book is an argument with God. God, why are you allowing the people to be oppressed? God, why would you allow the Babylonians to come and conquer us? They follow the god Chemosh. They don't even follow you. And God says, the righteous man shall live by his faith. All right. Yes, sir. Well, sure you can comment. Yeah.
Have you got an Alexa?
Do I have an Alexa?
An Alexa that you talk to?
Oh, yes. The Chinese government knows everything that happens in my house.
Then
Or is it the CIA?
I think of God as with Adam and Eve in the garden, that he was like Alexa, except Alexa can't answer all the questions you ask. She'll say, I don't know that. I mean, that's the end of it. But if you're in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, you ask a question, he's got an answer for all of it. I think that was part of the joy of Adam and Eve living in the garden. They could be curious about something, and God had the answer. Now, I'm a very curious person. My wife, Kenna, wonders why I poke my nose into everything. It's because I'm so interested in everything.
Right.
But I think we sometimes forget God is going to let us be inquisitive in heaven too. And he's not going to just automatically give us every answer, I don't think. I think he's going to make us enjoy learning all the way through eternity. So we so often think that the enjoyment we have on earth, if it's righteous, is going to continue to a higher degree in heaven. And so we need to enjoy this life, and I do, but also need to know it won't stop when I get to heaven. And so that's part of the continuousness that you can have in God. You can always be happy,
Yeah, that's right.
whether you're here or whether you're in heaven.
That's true. And we're always going to learn. That's right. What's the song? Tempted and tried. We're oft made to wonder how it should be thus all the day long when there are others about us living, however. Never molested though in the wrong. Farther along we'll know all about it. Farther along we'll understand why. Cheer up, my brother. All right. You see that which has happened there. Now look at verse 18. 18's rough. Okay. I said in my heart concerning the condition of the sons of men, God tests them, and they see that they themselves are like animals. Okay? How are people like animals?
If we look in the Word of God, we'll see how we're
Okay, yeah.
we're very imperfect.
We're very imperfect, run by base emotions. Primarily here, I think it's talking about death. You know, people have laughed at me before about this. I've conducted 2 funerals for dogs. And that sounds silly, doesn't it? But the reason I've done it usually with, people who are close friends. For a lot of people, a dog is a member of their family. Now, I'm not going to tell you a dog goes to heaven. A dog does not have a soul like we do. Maybe dogs will be in heaven with us. I'm sure cats won't. They're mean. But maybe dogs will make it to heaven. But a funeral is not for the dead person. A funeral is for the family. But man, it rocks our world when a pet that we love passes away. And everything we know dies. Everything we know of the flesh is gone. And while we by faith stand at that grave and recognize people one day will rise from that grave, we caught up in the air and we'll meet them with Jesus, it's still difficult. And Solomon's talking about the darkness of the world. And as he's talking about injustice, he's talking about these wonderful things. He brings up, animals, they die. Things, and people die. God's so great. God's so wonderful. What about my mother? What about my father? What about my spouse? What about my child? We're like animals. It's what it looks like and feels like. And a lot of the ideas of the world is that we are just material beings and there's nothing spiritual within us. And it's just a difficult thing for us to look at. All right, 19. What happens to the Son of Man also happens to animals. One thing befalls them as one dies, so dies the other. Surely they all have one breath. Man has no advantage for animals because all is vanity. Now that is the view that comes from a physical person living in the world. Now, if you want to argue with a preacher a long time or find a religious person that, a scholar, and you want to argue with him for a while, talk to him about heaven or the second coming in the Old Testament. And say, show me where there's heaven in the Old Testament. Show me where there's the second coming in the Old Testament where we're going to live with God forever. Because the majority of the promises given to Israel are physical promises here upon the earth. You can find glimpses of it here in Ecclesiastes. You can find glimpses of it in the second half of Daniel, which very few people bother to read because it's so complicated. You can find hints of it in Jeremiah. But for the most part in the Old Testament, in Solomon's mind, most of what was happening was right here. And so in the Old Testament, they did not have the view, they did not have the opportunity to see what we get to see today. And that comes a little bit to 2 Peter 1. Even the angels were excited to see what some of these New Testament writers were writing down as we see that happening. Anybody want to comment about that? Because that's something we don't talk about very often. Lunchtime's getting close. All right. Look here in verse 20, or let's go to 21. Who knows the spirits of the sons of men, which goes upward, the spirit of the animal, which goes down to the earth? So I perceive that nothing is better that a man should rejoice in his own works, for that's his heritage. For what can bring him to see what will happen after him? All right, this word, who knows, so many times we can't see. But let's look at this list of 6 things. Solomon, starting 3:16, reflects on several problems we see in God's control of the world. There's wickedness, even though there's a good God. There are bad things happening in this world, even though God's in charge. That's hard for our mind to get straight. Why is there evil? Number 2, people created in the image of God seem to be no different than a dog or a cat or a possum or an armadillo, which we have now in Kentucky. It seems like nobody, we'll see this next week, nobody really can comfort the oppressed. People hug you at a funeral and say, if you need anything, call me, and you'll never see them again. People don't know how to comfort those who are oppressed. Envy is one of the greatest motivators that exist. People are so lonely. Okay? Most connected we've ever been, yet people are so lonely. And recognition for our accomplishments are soon forgotten. Now, there's a lot of contradictions happening here as we look through, and that's what Solomon's doing as he runs through this section. It teaches the same thing Proverbs does, just in a darker way. And he says there's all these contradictions, but you got to realize God is in charge. God is going to take care of you. Things are going to work out for good, but you've got to be faithful to him in every circumstance. Don't trust in your job. Don't trust in the money you make. Don't trust in your family that you have. Don't trust in your own accomplishments. Trust in God. Because God has placed, what's that phrase we looked at earlier? Eternity in our hearts. There's that cross shape in your heart, and nothing can fill it well except God. That's why you have to seek him first and keep his commandments. All right, any comment? All right, I'm done with you. What time we meet tonight? 6, okay? 6. Don't come at 5.